Inside Angola Prison, life sentence means life. In the heart of Louisiana, behind miles of barbed wire and armed guard towers, sits a prison so large it has its own zip code. A prison where more than 70% of the men inside will never walk free again. They call it Angola. Once a brutal slave plantation, it became the largest maximum security prison in the United States. Today, thousands of men wake up every morning knowing the same terrifying truth: their sentence does not end. Not next year. Not in 20 years. Not ever. Inside Angola Prison, a life sentence truly means life. And what happens behind these fences, how men survive decades, how power is enforced, and what the prison does to a human mind over time, is far more complex than most people imagine. The plantation that became a prison. Long before Angola became one of the most famous prisons in America, it was something else entirely. In the early 1800s, this land was a massive slave plantation stretching across nearly 18,000 acres along the Mississippi River. Enslaved Africans worked the cotton fields under brutal conditions. The plantation itself was called Angola, named after the African region many of the enslaved people had been taken from. After the Civil War ended slavery, the land changed ownership many times. But the system of forced labor never truly disappeared. In 1901, the state of Louisiana purchased the land and transformed it into a prison farm. Prisoners replaced enslaved workers. And the fields kept producing. Inmates were forced to harvest cotton, corn, and sugarcane, often under the watch of armed guards on horseback. The prison quickly gained a reputation for extreme brutality. Former prisoners described a system where beatings were common, medical care was minimal, and escape attempts were often deadly. For decades, Angola was considered one of the most violent prisons in the United States. But the real story of Angola is not just about its history. It's about the thousands of men who have lived, and died, inside it. And to understand that, you have to step inside the gates. Entering the largest maximum security prison in America. Angola is not a typical prison. It is a prison complex. The facility spans more than 18,000 acres, making it larger than Manhattan. Inside those fences are multiple prison camps, industrial buildings, farmland, chapels, dormitories, and cell blocks. More than 5,000 inmates live here. Many were convicted of violent crimes, murder, armed robbery, and aggravated assault. But what truly defines Angola is the number of men serving life without parole. In Louisiana, life sentences historically meant exactly that. No parole. No release. Just decades inside prison walls until death. For many inmates arriving at Angola, the moment they step off the transport bus is the moment they realize something chilling. This prison will likely be the last place they ever live. And the system here is designed with that reality in mind. Because when inmates know they will never leave, maintaining control becomes far more complicated. And sometimes far more dangerous. The first day, processing the new arrivals. Every new prisoner arriving at Angola goes through intake. The process begins with identification. Fingerprints. Photographs. Medical screenings. Then comes classification. Officials determine where each inmate will live, what level of security they require, and whether they pose a risk to others. But paperwork alone cannot predict what really happens once a prisoner enters the population. Because Angola has its own unwritten rules. And new inmates quickly learn that survival depends on understanding them. Some prisoners arrive young, barely in their 20s. Others are older men sentenced after decades of criminal activity. But once inside, age and background matter less than something else: reputation. Within hours, word spreads across the dormitories. Who is new? What they did? How long they're staying? And in Angola, the most common answer to that last question is simple. Forever. Daily life in a prison built for permanence. The Angola day begins early. Around 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning, lights come on in many dormitories. Guards conduct counts. Breakfast is served in large prison cafeterias. Afterward, thousands of inmates head to their assigned jobs. Unlike many prisons, Angola still operates as a working prison farm. Inmates grow crops, raise cattle, and maintain large sections of farmland. Others work inside industrial shops. Some repair vehicles. Others manufacture furniture or license plates. For the prison administration, the labor keeps the institution running. For inmates, the work does something else. It fills time. And inside a prison where many men will spend 40, 50, or even 60 years, time becomes the most dangerous enemy. Because when prisoners have too much idle time, tensions rise. Violence increases. And control becomes harder to maintain. Which is why Angola operates almost like a self-contained town. But even with jobs, routines, and strict schedules, the psychological weight of a life sentence never disappears. In fact, For many men, it only grows stronger as the years pass. The unspoken power structure. Inside Angola, power exists on multiple levels. Officially, the prison is controlled by correctional officers and administrators. But like many long-term prisons, another system exists beneath the surface. The inmate hierarchy. Some prisoners gain influence through physical strength, others through connections, and some through something more subtle, experience. Men who have spent decades inside Angola often become unofficial leaders within their dormitories. They know the routines. They understand the rules. And younger inmates sometimes rely on them for guidance. But influence inside prison can also be dangerous. Because when authority is unclear, conflicts emerge. Debts, disrespect, territory disputes. Sometimes these issues end quietly. Other times they erupt into violence. And Angola's history is filled with stories of both. But the most terrifying part of prison life is not always the violence. It is the slow passage of time. The realization that decades are slipping away with no possibility of freedom. And for some men, that realization leads to something unexpected. Transformation. Men who will die inside. More than 2/3 of Angola's inmates are serving life sentences. Many have already spent 20, 30, or 40 years inside. Over time, the prison population begins to age. Some prisoners arrive young and grow old within the same walls. They watch generations of inmates come and go. They witness guards retire. They see the outside world change through television and letters. But they never experience it themselves. Medical care becomes a growing issue. Angola has its own prison hospital to treat aging inmates. Wheelchairs are common. So are chronic illnesses. Eventually, some prisoners are transferred to hospice units within the prison. Because when life sentences truly mean life, prisons must prepare for something most institutions were never designed to handle. Large numbers of elderly inmates dying in custody. But Angola developed something unusual to address this. A hospice program run partly by prisoners themselves. And what happens inside that program reveals a side of prison life rarely seen by the outside world. The Angola Hospice Program. Angola's hospice program began in the late 1990s. It was created to care for inmates who were terminally ill and nearing the end of their lives. But the surprising part is who provides much of the care. Other inmates. Selected prisoners are trained to assist dying inmates during their final days. They help feed them, clean them, sit beside them. Sometimes simply talk with them during the long nights. Many of the volunteers are also serving life sentences. They know they will likely die inside the same prison. But the hospice program gives them something rare. Purpose. Some volunteers describe the experience as life-changing. For men who once committed violent crimes, the act of caring for someone at the end of life can become a form of redemption. But Angola is not only a place of reflection and aging. It is still a maximum security prison. And that means violence can never be completely eliminated. Violence behind the walls. Although Angola is considered less violent today than it was decades ago, conflict still occurs. Disputes between inmates can escalate quickly. Weapons are sometimes improvised from everyday objects. Metal fragments. Sharpened plastic. Pieces of broken tools. Prison administrators conduct regular searches to find contraband. Dormitories are inspected. Cells are checked. But in a facility housing thousands of inmates, complete control is nearly impossible. When violence happens, the response is immediate. Inmates involved in serious incidents may be transferred to restrictive housing units. These areas are designed for isolation and strict supervision. But even these units have their own controversial history. Because for some prisoners, isolation becomes another form of punishment lasting years, or even decades. The shadow of solitary confinement. Angola once held some of the most famous long-term solitary confinement prisoners in American history. Among them were members of a group later known as the Angola Three. These men spent decades in isolation following a controversial prison murder case in the 1970s. Their confinement sparked international debate about the psychological effects of long-term solitary housing. Human rights organizations argued that keeping prisoners isolated for decades amounted to cruel treatment. Prison officials insisted it was necessary for security. The debate lasted years. But it raised an important question about Angola and prisons like it: what happens to a human mind after decades behind bars? The answer is complicated. Some prisoners break. Others adapt. And a few find ways to rebuild their lives, even inside prison. Faith, education, and second chances that never lead outside. Over the past several decades, Angola has expanded programs focused on education, religion, and rehabilitation. One of the most notable is the Angola Seminary, a theological program that trains inmates to become ministers. Graduates often serve as spiritual leaders within the prison. They counsel other inmates, lead services, help mediate conflicts. Education programs also offer classes in literacy, vocational training, and college-level studies. But here is the unusual part. Many participants know these programs will never lead to release. There is no parole waiting, no job waiting outside. The transformation happens purely for personal reasons. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If someone truly changes after decades in prison, should they still remain there until death? The legal system in Louisiana has wrestled with that question for years. But the answers are still evolving. The prison rodeo. One of the strangest traditions at Angola is the prison rodeo. For decades, the prison has hosted a rodeo event where inmates compete in bull riding and other dangerous contests. Spectators from outside the prison attend the event. Inmates participate voluntarily. Some compete for prize money. Others simply for the thrill of doing something different in a place where most days look exactly the same. Critics argue the rodeo turns prisoners into entertainment. Supporters say it provides rare opportunities for inmates to earn money and interact with the outside world. But for many participants, the rodeo means something else entirely. A temporary escape from routine. Because inside Angola, routine is relentless. Days become months. Months become years. And eventually, years become entire lifetimes. The reality of dying in prison. Behind the prison complex lies a cemetery. Rows of white crosses stretch across the ground. Many of the names belong to inmates who died while serving life sentences. Some families claimed the bodies. Others never did. For those prisoners, Angola became both their final home and their final resting place. The cemetery is a quiet reminder of what a true life sentence means. Not just decades in prison, but an entire life lived and ended behind the same walls. Angola Prison is often described as a city of the condemned. Thousands of men living inside fences, knowing most will never leave. Yet within that harsh reality are complicated human stories. Stories of violence. Stories of regret. Stories of survival. And sometimes, stories of unexpected transformation. But the question Angola forces society to confront is not only about crime or punishment. It is about time. What does it mean to take away an entire lifetime? And when a man spends 40 or 50 years behind bars, who does he become by the end? Inside Angola Prison, the sentence is simple. Life means life. And for thousands of men, that reality continues tomorrow morning, when the lights turn on again. The rules of survival. For someone newly arriving at Angola, survival begins with observation. Prisoners quickly learn that the official rulebook is only part of the reality. There are also unwritten rules, rules enforced not by guards, but by other inmates. Disrespect is one of the fastest ways to create trouble. Something as simple as sitting on another inmate's bunk without permission can lead to confrontation. Borrowing items without returning them can escalate into violence. Inside Angola, possessions carry meaning. A pair of shoes. A radio. A photograph. These objects may seem small from the outside, but inside prison they represent identity, territory, and status. New inmates are often told the same advice by older prisoners: watch, listen, and speak only when necessary. Some men follow that advice and adapt quickly. Others struggle to understand the delicate balance of prison culture. And sometimes, the consequences are immediate. But what many outsiders do not realize is that violence is not constant chaos. In fact, long-term prisons like Angola often operate on an uneasy stability. Because when thousands of men know they will spend decades together, constant violence becomes unsustainable. Instead, the prison develops something more complicated. A system of negotiated peace. The longest sentences. Angola holds some of the longest-serving prisoners in the United States. There are men who entered these gates in the 1970s and remain there today. Others arrived during the crime waves of the 1980s and early 1990s, when tough sentencing laws filled American prisons. For these inmates, time becomes difficult to measure. The outside world changes faster than they can follow. Technology evolves. Cities grow. Entire generations are born and raised. But inside Angola, the rhythm remains almost the same. Wake up. Work. Eat. Return to the dormitory. Repeat. Some prisoners mark the passage of time with calendars or journals. Others stop counting years entirely. Because when freedom is no longer part of the future, time begins to lose its meaning. And that psychological shift can affect men in very different ways. Some become withdrawn. Others become mentors to younger inmates. And a few become something unexpected. Historians of prison life. Memory and regret. For prisoners who have spent decades at Angola, memories often become their most powerful companions. Some write letters to family members they have not seen in years. Others keep journals documenting prison life. Many reflect on the crimes that brought them here. Regret is a word frequently heard in long-term prisons. But regret does not erase consequences. And Angola is a place built entirely around consequences. Over the years, some prisoners begin to speak openly about their past actions, particularly in mentoring programs. Younger inmates entering the prison are sometimes warned by older prisoners who say the same thing: do not waste your life the way we did. These conversations rarely happen in dramatic moments. They happen quietly. During work assignments, inside prison classrooms, or while sitting in the yard during the afternoon count. But even with reflection and change, one reality remains constant. Most of these men will still die inside Angola. And that knowledge shapes every relationship within the prison. Families on the outside. For inmates serving life sentences, family connections become fragile over time. At first, visits may happen regularly. Parents arrive. Spouses come. Children sit across metal tables trying to understand why their father cannot come home. But as the years pass, life outside continues moving forward. Parents grow older and eventually pass away. Children become adults. Some families relocate or lose contact entirely. For inmates who have spent 30 or 40 years in prison, visits often become rare. Letters slow down. Phone calls decrease. Eventually, some prisoners realize something painful. The world they once belonged to has continued without them. But Angola has tried to preserve some family connections through extended visiting programs. In certain cases, inmates can spend longer periods with relatives in designated areas of the prison. These visits offer rare moments of normal conversation. Moments where prison walls briefly fade into the background. Yet when the visit ends, the reality returns. The gates close. And the inmate remains behind. The guards. Life inside Angola is not defined only by prisoners. Thousands of correctional officers have worked here over the decades. Many come from nearby Louisiana communities. Some families have multiple generations employed by the prison. Working at Angola requires constant awareness. Officers supervise large groups of inmates, often in environments where tension can rise quickly. Despite the strict structure, interactions between officers and inmates vary widely. Some officers maintain purely professional distance. Others develop long-term familiarity with prisoners they supervise year after year. Because in a prison where inmates may spend 40 years inside, the same guards sometimes remain part of their daily lives for decades. This unusual stability creates a complicated environment. It is not friendship. But it is not always hostility either. It is something closer to coexistence. Two groups of people sharing the same confined world. Escapes that rarely succeed. Angola's geography makes escape extremely difficult. The prison sits in a remote bend of the Mississippi River. 3 sides of the prison are surrounded by water. The remaining areas are protected by multiple layers of fencing, patrol roads, and armed guards. Historically, escape attempts have occurred, but few succeed. Inmates know the surrounding land is rural farmland with limited hiding places. Even if someone managed to reach the river, crossing it would be dangerous. For most prisoners, escape becomes more fantasy than realistic plan. Instead, survival depends on adapting to life inside. And for some inmates, that adaptation leads to surprising achievements. Prison journalism and storytelling. Angola is home to one of the longest-running prison newspapers in the United States. Called The Angolite, the publication is written and edited largely by inmates. The newspaper has won multiple journalism awards for investigative reporting. Stories written by prisoners have covered topics ranging from prison reform to inmate life. For many incarcerated writers, journalism becomes a way to document a world rarely seen by outsiders. It also provides something deeply important: a voice. Through writing, prisoners describe their experiences, frustrations, and reflections. Some articles explore the criminal justice system. Others examine life inside Angola itself. But what makes these stories powerful is their perspective. They come from people who have spent decades inside the system they describe. Aging behind bars. One of the biggest challenges facing Angola today is aging prisoners. As life sentences accumulate, the average age of inmates rises. Many prisoners now suffer from illnesses associated with old age. Heart disease, diabetes, mobility problems. Providing medical care for elderly inmates is expensive and complicated. Special housing areas have been created for prisoners who can no longer work or move easily. Wheelchairs and medical equipment are now common sights in areas once dominated by younger inmates. But aging inside prison carries a unique emotional weight. Many elderly prisoners know they will never see freedom. Some simply hope to live long enough to reconnect with family members through visits or letters. Others focus on spiritual preparation for the end of life. And when that time finally arrives, the Angola hospice program often becomes their final stop. A prison that reflects society. Angola Prison represents more than a single correctional facility. It reflects broader questions about crime, punishment, and justice in the United States. Over the past several decades, debates about mass incarceration have intensified. Some critics argue that life sentences without parole remove any possibility of redemption. Others believe such sentences are necessary for the most serious crimes. Angola stands at the center of that debate, because within its fences are thousands of men who will never receive another chance outside. Yet many of them continue living full lives within the prison community. They work, study, teach, care for dying inmates, and search for meaning within the limits of their circumstances. As night falls over Angola, the prison quiets. Dormitory lights dim. Guards complete their final counts. Thousands of inmates settle into their bunks. And for most of them, tomorrow will look exactly like today. Another sunrise over the fields. Another day of work. Another reminder that the outside world exists somewhere beyond the fences. But for the men inside Angola, that world may never return. Because here, the sentence is not measured in years. It is measured in lifetimes. And inside Angola Prison, life truly means life. Angola Prison is more than just the largest maximum security prison in America. It is a place where thousands of men wake up every day knowing the outside world may never be part of their lives again. Behind those fences are stories of violence, regret, survival, and sometimes unexpected change. Some inmates spend decades searching for meaning in a place built around punishment. Others simply learn how to endure. But Angola leaves us with a difficult question. If a person spends an entire lifetime behind prison walls, who do they become by the end of it? And what does justice truly mean when the sentence lasts forever?